So thanks for the opportunity to present this today, largely because this is a new paper and a new project. It's unclear if the project will extend this paper, but we're going to do something with the paper, so your feedback will be valuable. And this is work that Danny Hayes and I are doing in a never-ending set of projects where we're now inextricably linked together. So basically, I want to start with the cursory slide that everybody that ever gives a Women in Politics talk starts with. I don't know if you've heard, but women in US politics are fundamentally underrepresented in terms of numeric representation. Even after the 2018 Year of the Woman, where we saw an unprecedented number of women get elected, even after last night's State of the Union, where there were a sea of white suffragettes, the reality is that men are still the overwhelming majority of our political institutions, whether we're looking at the federal, state, or even local level. And the United States still fares very poorly when it comes to broad representation in the national legislature. Currently, 100 nations surpass the United States in the percentage of women in the national legislature. So there are lots of reasons why, and those are not, some of those are structural, some of those have to do with the way elections are run, but the reality is that we're not doing that well. And to put this number in context, when I was in graduate school and I started doing work on women in politics, we actually ranked 57th. So in the last 20 years, we've fallen substantially, not because we've gotten worse. Women's representation has continued to creep up, but other nations have come to surpass us at a far greater rate than we're going ourselves. And to just put this into perspective, this is what a committee looks like in Rwanda's legislature, and here's the United States, right? So just visually, something seems like our political institutions are a little bit of a relic from the past. Although Jeff Flake, fortunately, is no longer there. And I say fortunately because he took to the House floor to condemn some of my other work that was funded by the National Science Foundation. So even if he's a problem solver and a collaborator, I have no place for him. All right, so the good news, though, is that when it comes to women's representation, voters seem okay with women, or at least we would think so, right? There's a ton of research that suggests that when women run for office, they raise just as much money as men. There's quite a bit of research to indicate that they're just as likely to win their races, both in terms of vote share and outcome. The news media, surprisingly, when you go away from the presidential level, tend to cover women and men very, very similarly. Danny and I, in our book, looked at the 2010 and 2014 midterm elections. And in those elections, no matter how you look at coverage, you just can't really uncover differences. The volume is the same, the content is the same, the mentions of how a candidate looks or what he or she is wearing are very rare, but also the same. And political operatives have grown increasingly amenable to recruiting women to run for office as well. So this is not equal on both sides of the aisle. The Democratic Party has moved at a faster rate than the Republicans have, but there doesn't seem to be any explicit evidence of bias when it comes to identifying people to run for office. Again, that doesn't mean there's no gender dynamic. People tend to recruit from the networks where they operate, and our political circles are still heavily male-dominated, but there's no explicit sexism, at least when you look at surveys, both of recruiters and the people who are recruited. It's very difficult to find those patterns. So this is the good news, and if I was an optimist, I would say this is terrific. But there's also bad news, and the bad news is consistent with the conventional wisdom. And that conventional wisdom can be summed up in a series of headlines. So recently, after the 2018 elections, NPR ran a story, do women candidates have an advantage? And they conclude, no, voters think about female candidates differently. Don't run this year, the perils of Republican women facing a flood of resistance. For female candidates, harassment and threats come every day. Be likable, how female candidates are navigating sexism and racism in 2018. Why the likability question pursues 2020 female candidates even as they make history. And this was the Boston Globe just 2 days ago. Iowa women meet Warren and wonder anew about the glass ceiling. So there's this general sense that even if women can win their races, and even if donors will give to them and the media will cover them, navigating the campaign trail and having to interface with voters poses challenges for female candidates that men just don't have to surmount. And that's a common premise in political science literature. So those headlines are not sort of a straw man where I'm just showing you some examples of journalists and reporters who shockingly don't necessarily know systematically the way the world works. In political science, there is also quite a bit of literature to suggest that voters evaluate candidates through a lens of gender stereotyping. And that can create a situation in which voters perceive female candidates as lacking pivotal leadership qualities. So studies going back to the early 1980s and up through the early 2000s even, and sometimes even more currently, find there are circumstances under which voters are more likely to consider women empathetic, trustworthy, or having integrity, and they're more likely to consider men as strong leaders or as competent. And obviously, those same studies show that when push comes to shove, even when people are looking for sort of outside candidates, they tend to value competence and leadership a little bit more than they value trustworthiness, integrity, and empathy. And what that suggests is that when people look at candidates through this lens of stereotyping, they are not necessarily going to be as amenable to the idea of a female candidate because she's going to score lower in their calculus on those leadership and competence traits. And there's also some evidence that suggests that women just might not be seen as having qualities requisite for the politician role. The times that women have really seen an upsurge in their representation are when the ethos is sort of throw the bums out, right? So it suggests that women do well when we're not looking for politicians. But the majority of the time, and in the 510,000 elected offices across this country, we generally think about politicians as the people we would want to occupy them. So this is sort of the common premise in the literature. But there's uncertainty. So first of all, there are several recent studies that suggest that these findings might be somewhat dated. As partisan polarization has increased, it's becoming increasingly common to find national studies to reflect the fact that partisanship is a far more important identity and value than anything else. And so that's not to say that there aren't still card-carrying sexists out there. There might be. But even though they're card-carrying sexists, the only thing more unappealing to them than voting for a woman is voting for somebody of the other party. So in terms of actual outcomes, even if these gender stereotypes exist, they're probably not determinative, or at least some evidence suggests that. And frankly, motivated reasoning suggests, too, that people are more inclined, when it's somebody of the same party, to evaluate them highly on all of these traits. So when we look at several election cycles using the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, we find that Democrats think that Democratic men and women are indistinguishable and pretty amazing when it comes to leadership, competence, integrity, and empathy. Republicans feel the same way about Republican male and female candidates. And both sides hate the other side and think that women and men are equally incompetent, poor leaders, lacking integrity, and unempathetic. And then there's some work that even suggests that there's an advantage. The interesting thing here is you'll notice that the same people who think that this is a problem acknowledge that sometimes it's an advantage as well. So like there's just sort of like a mishmash out there. And so that's where we come in. We want to try and clarify the conditions under which gender stereotyping could matter and the circumstances under which it wouldn't. And so what we do is we delineate, and I'm going to show you, a set of conditions where if voters are stereotyping, and if these stereotypes are harmful to female candidates, they should emerge. And if under these conditions we don't find evidence that gender stereotypes harm female candidates, then this is a pretty easy test. We should probably be willing to move on to some other important research questions in the subfield. I won't write it like that in the paper. All right, so what are the conditions under which gender stereotypes could be harmful? There are a few. The first is when partisanship is out of the equation, right? I told you that people don't like to vote for people outside the party, and these card-carrying sexists are going to say, oh my gosh, women shouldn't be allowed to drive, but they should be allowed to be in Congress as long as they share my party affiliation. If that party affiliation is out of the equation, and they're voting when partisanship can't provide any useful information, they might be more inclined to say, yeah, I'm going to rely on gender as a useful cue here. Given a male Democrat and a female Democrat, or a male Republican and a female Republican, I'm going to sort of invoke, not consciously, but I'm going to invoke some of these stereotypes that I have about women and men. So gender stereotypes could be harmful when you've got conditions where partisanship is out of the equation. Also when they're being invoked implicitly. We know from the race and politics literature that voters generally, and people who are responding to surveys in particular, don't like it when they might be perceived as racist or sexist. And so they're far more inclined to eschew ideas of sexism or racism when they're explicitly reminded that the question or the candidate or the circumstance they're evaluating is about a woman or is about a person of color. And so when a stereotype is invoked implicitly, and I'll show you some examples of those in a minute, it's more likely that they could actually do harm because there's going to be less of a pushback effect. And then finally, stereotypes should matter if among the electorate you've got a decent number of voters who just don't think that gender equality is that important. Now, that includes the card-carrying sexists, but that also includes people for whom gender discrimination is just not something that they worry that much about, or gender equality is not something that's very salient in their calculation of what matters in the political arena. So we'd argue that these three ingredients, if they all sort of coalesce, could present a political environment where gender stereotypes could, in fact, harm or work to the detriment of female candidates. Now, working against this backdrop, though, are a few other conditions which make, we would argue, even these conditions perhaps unlikely to generate clear effects of gender stereotyping. The first is that a wide variety of literature coming out of the campaigns and elections field suggests that voters don't like it when candidates attack each other. And that's especially the case when they attack women. So people are far more inclined to say that they, or approve of a candidate who runs a positive campaign about his or her own assets than taking down a man or a woman who they're running against. And the reality is that most gender attacks make their way into media coverage, make their way to the voters because the opponent invokes it. So we've reached a point in time where journalistic norms, again, apart from the presidential election, are such that it's unlikely for reporters to speak specifically in a way that would cue gender stereotypes. The most common way that they do that is to quote an opponent who himself has attacked a woman or has generated an implicit or an explicit message that cues that candidate's gender. Second, gender has become increasingly salient to voters in the last, since 2008, in general, more specifically since 2016, right? And traditional attitudes about gender are less common now than they've been in the past. So again, that's not to say that people don't still adhere to some gender roles, but that's on the decline, and political movements like Me Too are on the rise. And so the idea that people aren't thinking about this, the idea that people don't think gender discrimination is important, are not working in favor of the idea of gender stereotypes mattering. So you've got these competing sets of expectations, ostensibly because I believe that institutions probably tell us most of what we need to know. I fall on the side of it's very unlikely that gender stereotyping is going to emerge because campaigns and elections are structured in such a way that it makes it unlikely. But let's test and see whether, so we create an experiment that provides an opportunity, we hope, pretty fairly to assess whether there actually is room for this gender stereotyping. So the experiment, we have two studies. The first was in September of 2006, so it's amid the election. It started out as a pilot, but we actually thought it was okay, so it's not a pilot. So we've got 1,000 MTurk respondents. In June of 2018, we did a very similar study with 2,200 respondents via Lucid. Does everybody know what Lucid is? So Lucid is like the new best thing to happen to political science. Every respondent is $1. But basically what they've done is they've purchased survey respondents from a series of other representative samples. So like they've purchased groups of respondents from SSI, from Knowledge Networks or GFK, from YouGov, and they've assembled all of them into a huge database. And so they have relationships that allow them to buy those survey respondents at a cheaper rate, and then they can compile a representative sample. And it turns out in the paper, the sample for the Lucid sample matches almost perfectly with the ANES sample. So it's a pretty good representative sample, or at least as good as you're going to get from public opinion data. We have some pre-survey questions about demographics and also their attitudes about gender equality. I'll show you those measures in a minute. And then there's the treatment. And so everybody was assigned to one of 10 treatment groups. And those groups were, 9 treatment groups and 1 control. Where basically the main treatment was reading a mock newspaper article that summarized a competitive state legislative primary between Martin Simpson and Deborah Reeves. Respondents were asked what their party affiliation was, and that was the primary that they were assigned to. We randomly assigned independents to either the Democratic or the Republican primary. Independents that weren't even leaning, though, were only about 9% of the sample, and when we take them out, the analysis looks exactly the same. You might be thinking it's kind of antiquated to give them a mock newspaper article. Unfortunately, you're not right. The reason that you're not right is because the overwhelming majority of news that people get about congressional races, state legislative contests, and local politics is still through the local newspaper, which is why the demise of local news is so detrimental, right? We tend to think about cable news and radio and national coverage, but if you're not running for president and you're not in a hotly contested Senate or gubernatorial race, odds of your race getting any kind of coverage in those outlets is virtually zip. So this is how people encounter information about state legislative contests. All right, so this is what happened. There are these conditions. So the control group, and both studies are roughly the same, the control group reads a brief recap about the Simpson and Reeves race, and they find out that they're locked in a tight battle. They both also have the same experience. They're both previous office holders, and they're both, from the district. Then there were a group of people that got an explicit gender attack. In study 1, it was the same article, but Simpson criticized Reeves. He said, she's a woman, and that's the only reason I think she's doing as well as she is. I think she's not qualified. And in the second study, he said, as a woman, she's just not tough enough to get the job done. So we're cueing both qualifications and toughness, which are two of the broad stereotypes that the literature suggests could be the most detrimental, where women are seen as less tough than men and perceived to be less qualified than men. And in both of these, there's this explicit mention of the fact that Deborah Reeves is a woman. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's weird and artificial, but it's not. So here's during the 2016 election, I call her Crooked Hillary because she's crooked and the only thing she's got is the woman card. That's all she's got. It's a weak card in her hands. He's specifically calling attention to the fact that she's a woman. When Mitch McConnell ran against Allison Lundgren Grimes in 2014, during a debate, he said, I don't think arguing vote for me because I'm a woman is enough. You can see that she didn't like that argument, and then he probably regretted saying it. But so the way that these explicit attacks make their way into the coverage is probably rare. I mean, we're not saying that this is that common, but the way that we model them is externally valid. The implicit attack is exactly the same, except we get rid of the phrase as a woman. So here, Simpson's saying she's just not that qualified, which is implicitly potentially cueing this gender stereotype, and she's just not tough enough to get the job done. And then that's also externally valid. Dean Heller, who was running for the Senate in 2018, was running against Jackie Rosen, and he ran a series of press releases that were called Jackie is Weak. So this one was Jackie Rosen is weak on Iran. If you go to his website, it turns out Jackie Rosen is weak on everything. And so he was cueing people to think of this female candidate as somebody who is weak. He never mentions as a woman she's weak, but you name the issue and there's evidence that he's suggesting to voters that they should evaluate her through this lens of being a weak candidate. And then the third treatment was a non-gendered attack. Here, Simpson says that Reeves is bought by and will be accountable to big money donors paying for her campaign, or that she just doesn't share the values of the district. And the reason that we wanted to include this is because we want to be able to differentiate attacks from gender attacks. Because if it turns out that gender stereotyping is the mechanism here, then we should not uncover effects when it's just an attack that could be equally likely to apply to a man or a woman, and it doesn't conjure up any of these psychological references to in-group or out-group being a man or a woman. And then we also varied Deborah Reeves' response. She could either offer no response. There are some women's groups out there, for example, that say if you are attacked and you're a female candidate, ignore it because you don't want to call attention to it. Some people got a response where she called out Simpson and said that his attack smacks of sexism. Voters deserve a campaign that doesn't involve attacking women's qualifications or toughness in study 2. Or in some cases, she counterattacked, saying that Simpson's beholden to special interests that are funding the campaign. Now, it turns out that the response conditions never matter, and they account for no variation whatsoever. So in presenting the results, I'm going to pool together the people based on the article that they read and what the attack was, because it doesn't matter. All right, so there are some potential, yeah?
So there's can you describe sort of the total number of treatment conditions?
So there are 10. So you could get the control. You could get implicit with no response, implicit with sexism response, implicit with the beholden response. You could get implicit with no response, implicit with sexism, implicit with the counterattack. And you could get the gendered attack with the non-gendered attack with no response, non-gendered attack with the sexism response, non-gendered attack with the beholden response. And for our purposes, the attack was what leads to all the variation. How the female candidate responds to the attacks never changes anything. So I'm going to group everything. So what you'll see are just the explicit, implicit, and gendered attacks relative to the control. Okay, so how could potential effects manifest? We ask people, after they read the article, to rate the candidates on a scale from 1 to 10, just a basic favorability scale. We also give them a battery of traits. I'm not going to show you all of the traits, but we ask among about 7 or 8 different traits whether they think the person is qualified, tough, or sexist. These also serve as checks to make sure they were paying attention if they read a story about qualified, toughness, or sexism. And we're interested in net evaluations. So this is what separates us a little bit from some of the other studies. A lot of the work that finds gender effects finds that women pay a price when there's a gender stereotypic attack launched against them. But they don't look at whether a man ever pays the price for launching that attack. And so we're interested in the net effect because if the man suffers more harm than the woman does when he says something that's gender stereotypic, then you can't argue that at the aggregate level there's any sort of detriment to the female candidate. It might not be a nice way to campaign, it might be keeping gender dynamics alive in society, but in terms of whether these gender stereotypes are systematically doing harm to a female candidate, you can't really make that case. All right, so what do we find? So let me show you first net favorability as a difference from the control group. So basically what we did here was we looked at the control group and we took the net favorability of Simpson and the net favorability of Reeves. They were not statistically different in the Republicans at all. They were each rated about a 6 on the 10-point scale. Among Democrats, Reeves was 6.4, Simpson was 6.1, which is consistent with the general population, where Democrats tend to like female candidates a little bit more. Anyway, that difference we then compared to the differences within each of the treatments. So we see that both explicit and implicit attacks help Reeves. So let me just show you. This is the Democratic primary. So notice for the explicit attack, the difference between Reeves and Simpson is about 2.5 points higher than in the control group, but it's positive. So when there's an explicit gender attack launched against Reeves, her net favorability actually increases among Democrats. The implicit attack also works. It's less powerful, but it increases her net favorability. And the same thing is true in study 2, which is the Lucid study. Notice that the non-gendered attack does not have an effect. So people are not necessarily rewarding Reeves or penalizing Simpson just because there was an attack against Reeves. It's when the attack is gendered, we wind up seeing a positive net benefit for the female candidate. Nick, did you have a?
No.
So this is the Democratic primary. In the Republican primary, the results are generally the same, especially when the sample size is big enough. In the MTurk study, we hardly had any Republicans. But the story is consistent, the magnitude of the effects are smaller. But in 7 of the 8 conditions, this means that there's no evidence to suggest that the effect is harmful. And in the one condition where it looks like, in the control group in the Republicans, where the woman is actually doing a little bit worse, it's not statistically different. So there's really no evidence to suggest that on net favorability, the attack is hurting. In fact, you could argue perhaps that it's helping.
So now I do have a quick question. So this is all net. Do you have any, are there patterns? I mean, is who's hurt or who's helped?
That's where I'm going. Stay tuned. Okay.
I can key that up for you.
So let's look at who's hurt and who's helped. So here we can look at the assessments of Simpson and Reeves traits. And because it's a 2-part story, right? So this is, again, the Democratic primary. The blackened in balls are Simpson, the male candidate. The open circles are Reeves. So notice that when you, and again, these are not net differences. These are the actual assessments of the candidates. So relative to the control group. So notice that when Simpson attacks Reeves explicitly, he pays a bigger price than she does. When he attacks her implicitly, he pays a bigger price than she does. And the non-gendered attack, there's no difference there. So part of the reason, and this is the case for both qualified and for tough. So part of the reason that we're seeing the net benefit accrue to Reeves is because Simpson is actually being hurt more than she is being helped by the attack. In the Republican primary, again, the results are somewhat muted, but the story is generally the same. The effect on the rating, these implicit and explicit attacks wind up suggesting to voters that the female candidate is actually a little bit more likely to be tough or qualified when somebody on the other side says that he or she is not. So there's some evidence to suggest that Reeves is being helped. We also asked, do you think Reeves and Simpson are sexist? Now, no one should think that Reeves is sexist. She hasn't done anything that's sexist. But we see here that they do think Simpson is. So in the Democratic primary, when he attacks her explicitly and explicitly, his sexism rating goes up, which is not helpful for evaluating net favorability. Notice that he's not considered sexist in the non-gendered attack. There, he's just seen as somebody who's attacking another candidate, which voters don't love, but there's no similar price to be paid. And in the Republican primary, the same thing is true, right? Like, it's not a situation where Republicans don't see sexism. They see it, especially in the explicit attack. Now, the final piece of this is that, as I mentioned earlier, perceptions might be this moderator. So I've shown you that in the primaries, we're not seeing evidence that gender stereotyping is necessarily harming a candidate. We do see some evidence that explicit conditions are particularly likely to actually have the effect that it helps. But we would expect that this would especially be true for people who are in a position where they're not particularly concerned with, or they don't find gender discrimination or gender equality salient. So we created a scale. We asked on our survey before they were exposed to the treatment, a series of questions about gender. And we embedded these and smushed them around and mixed them in with lots of other questions that were not about gender. We asked them basically how much they hate lots of different groups and lots of different kinds of people. And so, but the measures that we're using are how much discrimination do they think women face in society, and do they think that discrimination is no longer a problem? Has society reached the point where women and men have equal opportunities, and they think feminism has had an important impact? The Cronbach's alpha is like 0.77 or 0.78, so it's generally fine. And the results are not that different if we use only one of the measures or if we put them in separately. Ultimately, we categorize people as being either above or at or below the median of this scale. But the results that I'm going to show you are pretty consistent even when we break people up into quartiles or deciles. So this is just for ease of exposition. All right, so what do we see? Well, if we go back to those net favorability scores, the people who are above the median are more likely to respond to both the explicit and the implicit attacks in a way that's helpful to the female candidate. And that's what we would expect, right? When they find out that a candidate is being attacked and gender discrimination and gender equality is something that's salient to them, and they sort of score high on this I'm aware of gender variable, then they're more likely to reward her and punish him for making that attack. Again, it's roughly consistent in the same studies. On the Republican side of the aisle, you get more muted effects, but they're in the same direction. So even if there's not clear evidence that across the board it works the same way for the Republicans, there's certainly no evidence to suggest that there's any kind of systematic harm done among Republicans when a male candidate attacks the female candidate. So what do we see? We see that attacks by a male opponent that invoke gender stereotypes do nothing to harm the female candidate's electoral standing. In fact, among the Democrats, it can even help. And that's regardless of how the candidate responds. And the pattern is most pronounced among the Democrats, but it's also consistent on the Republican side of the aisle. And so what that means is that we're not in an environment where all of this, where sort of like the lack of gender stereotypes are driven only because one party is overcompensating and the other party is still relying on these stereotypes. But obviously there are some caveats and concerns, and so I just want to spend a minute or two talking about them. So the first is the elephant in the room, right? How can I present this and have been aware of what happened in 2016, you might be wondering? Because we all read a million articles about how Hillary Clinton was the victim of gender stereotypes. And frankly, what I would say is I'm not convinced that Hillary Clinton's experiences are inconsistent with what we found for a couple of reasons. The first is, for every study that you find that suggests that hostile sexism cost Clinton a vote, you find another study that suggests that hostile sexism actually motivated voters and helped her. Moreover, I am always very leery to generalize from one case to the entire world, and I'm especially leery to do it when we have no idea if sexism or Clintonism, he's in the background, kept Hillary Clinton from being as successful and as appealing as she might have been. The other thing I would note is it's possible that the gendered nature of the campaign did help Donald Trump among some voters, but it also helped Hillary Clinton among some voters. And the net differential, perhaps her 3 million extra votes, is consistent with the story that we have. The other thing is there are social desirability concerns. A lot of people would say, well, you can't really ask people to evaluate candidates because they know what's going on here. And the good news for studies of gender is that it's less of a, probably because society hasn't evolved that much, it's less of a problem in studies of gender than it is in race. So there's no clear evidence. Dan Hopkins has a pretty compelling piece that shows that people answer questions about women in politics in a way that's very consistent with how they actually behave. So there's far less shame associated with saying, oh, I think female candidates are crummy, than there is with saying, oh, I think a candidate of color is a weak candidate. Also, obviously, in all experiments like this, you have to wonder, this is one article, like what if these candidates, voters often have a more pre-existing relationship with a candidate. But if that's the case, the more you know, the less likely you are to rely on gender stereotypes in the first place. So in some ways, this was an easy test because information fills in the gaps. Stereotypes are useful informational cues in the face of a lack of knowledge. The other thing that I would note here is that once you have this pre-existing relationship, you could also make the case that even in the face of stereotypic information, you're not going to change your mind, right? You're going to use motivated reasoning to say that, well, he didn't mean to be sexist. What he was really saying is X. But Deborah Reeves supporters should feel the same way, too. So there's nothing to suggest theoretically that the male candidate would benefit from motivated reasoning in a way that the female candidate wouldn't. And then finally, there is evidence to suggest that the political environment could matter. So in cases where stereotyping has emerged, there are certain issues that seem to be more problematic for women. So when war or terrorism or economic insecurity are at the top of people's lists, it's then that there seems to be more of a problem for female candidates. But men suffer from this too. And when social policy issues are at the top of the list, or when crime or corruption is at the top of the list, female candidates tend to have an advantage. So you've got a situation where it's very conditional. It's not to say that these stereotypes could never matter, but chances are the differences are going to come out in the wash. And so at the end of the day, I think we actually are at a point in time where we can probably say that not only are women equally likely to get elected, not only do they face similar experiences on the campaign trail, but gender stereotyping is probably not playing that much of a role, even in the kinds of environments where we would expect it to. And if we want to understand why women are so underrepresented in politics, then we need women to figure out why women aren't running for office in the first place. So I encourage you to read It Takes a Candidate Why Women Don't Run for Office, and It Still Takes a Candidate Why Women Don't Run for Office. So there we are. Paul. Oh, or Dan. I don't.
So two quick things. One, you said that Clinton was the elephant in the room. I sort of thought the elephant in the room was the elephant in the primaries, which is to say the muted effects of the Republican on the Republican side. And we probably all have hypotheses about that. So I was hoping you might just make it explicit what you think is going on there. The second thing that was really interesting on that Jackie Rosen attack, there's another implicit gender thing there. I want to get your thoughts. But he said something like she flirted with everyone in the, with every policy in the room. I was wondering if you thought that was a gendered attack.
Maybe. It's not a gendered attack in terms of how, let me answer that question first. So it might be a gendered attack, but it's not necessarily consistent with gender stereotyping and the way that stereotypes are supposed to work in how voters process candidate evaluations, right? So it could clearly be gendered, and she could potentially pay the price for that. But when we're thinking about trying to reconcile the competing findings in the literature, we're trying to look at sort of these traditional gender stereotypic issues and traits. And so, but yeah, that's why we would certainly never in our treatments have used the word like flirted.
Right.
And she won, so maybe.
Right.
As far as the muted effects on the Republican side are concerned, some of it has to do with the fact that the Republican voters, if you look at their scores on the gender discrimination scale, are significantly lower than the Democrats' scores. So there's more room there for gender to not be particularly salient. For us, the thing that's important there is that it's not harming the female candidate. So the worst case scenario is that the stereotypic attack is a wash. And that sort of flies in the face of the expectation that these attacks are going to be particularly harmful on the Republican side. So the fact that the effects are muted actually made us think, all right, maybe these treatments aren't so removed from reality, because we should expect that among the voters who are the most concerned about gender discrimination, we would see greater effects, and that's where we see them.
Yeah.
It's just that those voters are concentrated on the Democratic side of the aisle.
I think there might be a connection to what Nick was presenting a couple of weeks ago in terms of ambivalent sexism and Republican female candidates. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be the case. Although here too, like the differentiating between the explicit and the implicit attack even works the same way for both of those parties.
Yeah.
So the effects are muted, but the differences in the magnitude of the effect when you compare them to each other are roughly the same. Are you calling on people? I relegate all responsibility to Dan.
Well, I have a couple questions. So
I have like, it's
You
sort of a
mentioned
quick
Saber.
follow-up to Paul's, I think, or at least I'll make it sound like it is. I was curious, and this might fit with the kind of why the more muted among the Republicans, especially in the moderation. Your measure of gender awareness, it sounds to me like if we flipped that, it's a measure of sexism that runs from, the low end to kind of the middle. Right, because you're, as you call them, the card-carrying sexist, or the more, hostile and or benevolently sexist, are probably going to cluster at the low end of your scale, but
Right.
there's some variance there you're not
Right.
picking up. So I'm wondering if, might you be able to pick up the set of more likely to be Republican, but also some Democratic voters where these attacks do work if you had, a little more length on that scale.
So yes, and so we might be able to. When we look only at the bottom decile on that scale,
Right.
The effects are stronger. They're still not harmful, right? So the effects are consistent but smaller. So which means that the effect of being closer to being a card-carrying sexist is probably working its way toward you not being that concerned by either the explicit or the implicit attack. Unfortunately, we are limited in what else we can say about those people.
Sure.
But although if we did another, it would take us 10 minutes to do another study and we can just ask different questions. I mean, that's the amazing thing about this these days. Like, people used to be like, oh, I don't want to ask you to do another study. Literally, I can have the data to you like in 4 hours.
By the end of the Q&A.
So I
Thanks,
have
Dan.
two questions. And the labels for these are attribution and the choice set. And so I want you to think about first attribution. So what if the attack isn't from the other candidate, right? So the experiment and sort of the logic undergirding this is one which is generated by two candidate competition. Somebody wins and somebody loses, and so that's why it makes sense to look at these relative favorability differentials. But what if the attack comes from a third party, right? Like a partisan media source or some other confederate. Your results suggest that actually the person who's targeted does lose out. So if the targeting of that candidate is produced in such a way that it's not easily attributable to the male candidate in this case, then indeed he could potentially win from it. So do you see your results as being consistent with that potential interpretation? And the other is about the choice set. Thinking about this from outside the context of American politics, where often there's many candidates running against one another, potentially within the same political party. So in the primary setting in particular, what if there's more than two viable candidates? So in a setting where there's this one viable candidate that is making these attacks against a female candidate, he's losing out more than she is. But if you have 3 or 4 candidates, she's still getting that negative effect, and it might be that the person producing that is losing out, but the other candidates are winning more than she is. So how important here is the choice set? How important is attribution?
So as far as attribution is concerned, so that's a totally fair point. I would say two things. The first is that, especially for these kinds of contests, outside groups playing a role and anyone knowing that it happened is pretty rare. And so it's not to say that it's impossible, it's rare. Now we did do, a couple of years ago, another set of experiments more about attacking a candidate or mention it based on like what she was wearing. And so it wasn't gender stereotyping in this way, but it was sort of like suggesting that, she's not professional looking, or she, sort of getting at the same dynamics. And that was not by the other male candidate doing it, right? That was just, and what we found there was that the response was equally effective whether you were taking on a candidate or whether you were taking on a right-wing news organization or whether you were condemning a reporter for being unfair. And so basically voters didn't like the idea of a woman being attacked on what they thought was unfair grounds. And regardless of whether or not she responded or how, she didn't pay a price. The choice set is a really interesting question. And here what I should have said is that another broad finding from these results is the idea that if you attack your opponent, you're doing so at your peril in general, right? And so if you attack, maybe she'll pay a price, maybe she won't. In all these cases though, you're suffering more, which means especially in a case where you've got additional candidates out there, you're suffering more, maybe the one you attacked is suffering more, relative to everybody else, now they're doing better. So when you've got multiple candidates running, there would be even less of an incentive to generate these kinds of gendered attacks, and probably there would be less of an incentive to generate any kind of attack, because you saw also that the overall assessments of the candidates who attacked went down. The net effect was smaller than when it was an explicit or implicit gendered attack, but people still were not that excited about the idea of you being out there attacking.
Yeah, so I guess it seems to me a really important caveat here, which you haven't mentioned, is kind of an assumption that you can take the effects from a single article and then sum them up over all the articles or all the campaigning, and that strikes me as unlikely to be true. And so to take an example from what you've been saying, essentially, if you take this at face value, negative campaigning should be bad. It hurts the campaigner who's negative. And we all know that all the evidence is the public hates negative campaigning, and yet every political campaign does it because they believe it works. So either they're spending enormous amounts of money on something that actually should be hurting their candidates, or there's this process, this aggregation isn't working that way.
Right. So I'd say two things. The first is negative campaigning works because rarely do we have a situation where both candidates don't do it, right? So if the real test would be, and no candidate would be willing to give this a shot, right? The real test would be, all right, voters, you say negative campaigning doesn't work. I'm going to let candidate X throw everything he's got against me at the wall, and I'm just going to be a positive person, right? No candidate is going to allow that experiment to ever take place because it's risky. And so, I think that when you see that in an experimental setting, it's not necessarily inconsistent. It's just that in real life, there's no incentive for a candidate to behave that way. As far as your other point is concerned, I agree 100%, and that's why I don't really do experimental work. And so most of my work is survey research, but the reason we wanted to do this is because there's this big debate in the literature based all on experiments that look just like this. So all sort of one-offs and one-shot articles where there seem to be these conflicting findings, and there seems to be this general sense that either stereotyping helps women, or either stereotyping really hurts female candidates, or under certain circumstances they can at least mute the effect. And so we wanted to sort of say, all right, there are literally dozens of studies out there that are doing this. This would not be the approach that we think is the best way to actually assess what's going on, but let's try to at least sort out what's going on here and try to make sense of what seem like competing findings.
One thing I'm interested in here is this study's done in 2016 and 2018, right? So think about over time changes in the effects of gender stereotyping, and because it strikes me that this might be true in 2016 and 2018, but in the over time changes in the effectiveness of gender stereotypes, thinking about what is the age distribution, for example, in the samples, and have you looked at older range of ages? Do the same findings hold in age subgroups across these different groups?
I mean, so the lucid sample looks like is from 18 to 91. The MTurk sample is, a bunch of 45-year-olds that apparently have time to answer surveys while they're at work. So there, we've not, the fact that it works the same way there suggests that, maybe there's not that much going on here. We looked at, so we looked at age, we looked at the sex of the respondent, and we also looked at region. And we did not find anything to suggest that there was anything systematic going on. Like occasionally on one variable in one treatment, you would find the gender effect of the respondent or age. Like there was no sort of broad story. Because the other thing that I would note is partisanship as a social identity has not, and this wouldn't speak to primaries, but in general elections, is powerful across the board, right? And so like this broader sense of, well, how are people evaluating candidates suggests that age is not a big deal, right? Younger people are a little bit more likely to say, oh, I hate both parties, but then they're just as likely to be leaners. So,
You had said earlier that you weren't that concerned about the effects over time because people were less likely to be driven by stereotypes if they had more information about candidates. Are you concerned that gender stereotype might lead people to make systematically different evaluations over time? Like, you have two candidates and one, then the attack against both is weak, that for the male candidate it doesn't stick, but the female candidate builds up over time.
like that they would apply that to another candidate.
Or, that they, if the candidate is being attacked for being weak, that the male candidate over time, if the attacks won't sort of build up to the point where people believe it, but for the female candidate it might.
That's a good point. We didn't consider that. The gender stereotyping literature does not suggest that the gender stereotyping literature does not suggest that the stickiness of a stereotype varies by the sex of a candidate. So that doesn't necessarily get at the volume of the attacks that would cue the stereotype, but I think it mitigates the concern at least somewhat because she's responding. And so when she's, and the responses don't seem to matter, but we could test something like that to see if when she responds and calls him out and says, well, no, I'm not unqualified, or no, I am tough enough, that should be just as compelling. And you'd expect that when a candidate, if you think about the way campaigns and elections actually work, when a candidate is attacked on the same thing over and over and over again, they're going to be far more inclined to figure out a way to make people think that that's not true, right? It used to be, I remember, it used to be, oh, you never want to actually use the words of the attack because that's what people will remember you for. And then it became clear that, no, people wanted to hear why Hillary Clinton deleted her emails. Like, using the word email might have helped, right? Using the word, trustworthy might have actually helped. So, I think as artificial as this is, it would also be somewhat artificial to expect a female candidate to just sort of lay back as the same attack was being piled on.
Was there a pretty even distribution on your gender discrimination scale? And I know that kind of varies in partisanship, and for example, you had half, but was it pretty even people?
It was pretty normally distributed. So the mean was 0.6, and the median I think was 0.62. And we didn't have. So the bottom decile was a little bit smaller. I shouldn't say the bottom decile. The bottom. The people who scored the lowest, the people who scored the highest score for I'm very discriminatory, was a little bit bigger. That percentage was a little bit greater, I think maybe 3% than the people that were the least discriminatory, but it was generally normally distributed. Because the thing that helped that too, I mean, when we used each variable independently, it operated in roughly the same way. But the feminism question is what generates a lot of the normal distribution because people aren't that excited about feminism. So you get some people to say, no, I don't think it's been a positive force in society. Whereas for the other ones, sort of the right answer is a little bit more obvious.
Well,
Thank you.